I'm Gabriella Chesterson, and for most of my 20s, I felt less like a person and more like a family utility bill with feelings. I grew up in a small house on the edge of Halifax. My parents, Martin and Louise, still live there, and somewhere along the line, I became the default safety net. If anyone needed rent, I paid it. If the car needed insurance, I paid it. If the cat needed emergency surgery at 2 a.m., I was the one who put a credit card on the counter and watched the vet's relief like it was daylight. People say family like it's a shield. For me, it started as a soft umbrella and slowly turned into a canopy that blocked out everything else. My savings, my weekends, my ability to say no. I wasn't doing it from guilt at first. I liked being useful. I'd tell myself I was helping the people I love. That's comforting language for the person who forgot to check their own mailbox because they were organizing car insurance paperwork for someone else. My parents, Martin, who still thinks spreadsheets are witchcraft, and Louise, who cries at commercials and calls me twice a day, are good people. Not perfect, but good. It's my sister Tessa who became the storm. Tessa is 2 years older, charismatic in the way of people who never learned consequences. Great at convincing a room she's the hero, even when she burnt the kitchen down. She's had job after job, freelanced her way through stable paychecks, and managed to develop a talent for playing crises like instruments. Always dramatic, always urgent, and somehow always someone else's responsibility to fix. When I say my family relied on me, that's the generous version. The truth is messier. They relied on me for money not because I had an abundance, but because I had answers. I worked hard, late nights in a job that paid decently enough, and I believed, maybe foolishly, that supporting them was temporary. I would cover a month's rent, then two. I'd front a deposit for an apartment, then an insurance premium. I paid $100 here, $200 there, until my checking app started sending me the same worried little banner I'd been ignoring on my phone for weeks. What's at stake wasn't just my bank account. It was the quiet life I was trying to build. The idea of a future where I could make choices for me, not choices that kept someone else in neutral. The more I gave, the less room I had to do anything for myself. I missed friends' birthdays because I was sorting through another emergency text from Tessa. I let my lease renew without asking if I wanted to move. I told myself I was investing in family, but the investment kept paying dividends to everyone else. So that's the setup. Me, Gabriella Chesterson, the unofficial CFO, emotional counsel, and smoke detector for my family. Martin and Louise, who adore their kids but avoid conversations about money like they're landmines. And Tessa, whose personal economy looked like a cardboard box propped up against a storm. I'd been the steady hand for years, and the cost of steadying everyone else was becoming painfully, absurdly obvious. The pivot came in the form of a text at 8:13 a.m. on a Tuesday. I quit. What? I can't do that place anymore. I'll crash with you until I find something. Can you cover my rent for a few months? There was no build-up, no performance review, no let's talk about this. Just the kind of exit that looked like a dramatic scene in a bad play. I sat on my kitchen floor with my coffee cooling beside me and felt something thin and terrifying snap, not in the house, but inside me. For years, I had been the plug people pulled when the lights went out. I had propped up bad choices, smoothed over mistakes, and accepted temporary like a recurring bank charge. That morning, temporary read like a fraudulent pattern. Tessa's plan, as she explained in a follow-up call, was elegant in its audacity. She would take a few weeks to figure out her next steps, maybe start a little side hustle, a boutique online curio shop, Gabby. It's going to be huge. And in the meantime, I could cover her share of the rent and the utilities. She even framed it as an opportunity for me to be generous. The pitch was so practiced it could have been on a PowerPoint. I did the thing in my head that I'd been afraid to do in real life for years. I put the word no in a sentence and let it breathe. That's not on me, I said. The words were crisp and small, but they felt like putting a key in a lock I'd been avoiding. It wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. That same week, I signed a contract for a job in Chicago. I'd been offered the position months earlier, the sort of career move that made people nod with genuine surprise. Chicago? Wow, that's big. I'd hesitated because family needed me, because Tessa's temporary had once stretched for a year, because my parents' quiet pleas are a background hum I didn't know how to mute. Saying yes to Chicago was saying yes to a life that didn't revolve around being on call for emotional and financial fires. Signing the contract lit the fuse. My parents called first, the voice calls that start apologetically and end as guilt exercises. "We just worry," Louise said, the same voice that tells me to wear a coat in July. Martin's approach was more practical. "Are you sure you can afford the move? Have you thought about the logistics?" Which, translated, meant, "Can you still be our bank if you're gone?" Tessa escalated faster. She swung from wounded to weaponized in one breath. "How can you leave us? After everything I've done, you're choosing a city over your family." Then the real demand. She needed a co-signer for a business loan that, in Tessa speak, was both urgent and vague. "It's just paperwork. You sign, I get the funding, we're all fine." She said like it was a simple civic favor and not signing an IOU attached to someone else's pattern. When I refused to be the co-signer, the volume changed. There were veiled threats. Maybe don't expect an invite to Thanksgiving, and explicit manipulations. Long monologues about how my absence would break the family, lists of obligations only I could fulfill, and a cascade of emotionally blackmailing texts that read like a script for guilt. It stung less because I had miscalculated their reaction, and more because their anger came with the peculiar entitlement of people who believe your resources exist solely to make their lives easier. The more I held my boundary, the louder they got. That first week, they positioned themselves like a collective storm. The calls, the guilt, the threats, the casual assumption that I would always say yes. For the first time, I found clarity in the discomfort. Saying that's not on me didn't close a door so much as open a space I hadn't allowed myself to inhabit. Signing the Chicago contract was not an escape. It was a choice. They saw it as abandonment. I saw it as a border being drawn in the sand. The battle lines were being sketched in texts and voicemails, and somewhere between the cosigner demand and the Thanksgiving ultimatum, I realized the currency I'd been spending most was myself. I started treating my obligations like things you could unhook from a wall. It sounds small. Closing a joint account, changing the name on a lease, unsubscribing myself from auto payments. But each of those small, bureaucratic clicks felt like tiny acts of defiance. First, I audited everything. I sat at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet and a stack of mail and treated my life like a project that had been quietly outsourced. There were 3 credit cards tied to my name, where Tessa was an authorized user, 2 utility bills that routed through my account because it was easier that way, and a family streaming subscription that somehow listed my card as the primary payment method. I made calls, I filled forms. I walked into the bank and said, without shaking, "I need to remove myself from these accounts." The teller's eyebrows raised the polite question of why someone would give their name to other people like that in the first place. I didn't answer. I just handed over the paperwork. Tessa reacted the way people do when their safety net becomes a legal document instead of an emotion, with rage and bargaining. She texted like a metronome, angry at first, then performative remorse, then promises about paying back every cent. She even tried a different tack and sent a long, glossy PDF of a business plan for the curio shop, complete with mock-up logos and a projected timeline that assumed a miracle called cash flow. I printed it, folded it, and put it in a drawer with the stack of unpaid IOUs she'd left over the years. My parents oscillated between fear and pleading. Louise cried on the phone, real, ragged sobs, and told me how lonely Martin had seemed since I made my choice. Martin, bless him, sent spreadsheets of his own, projected budgets, different scenarios, calculations meant to make me feel both guilty and helpful. I read them, made notes in the margins, and still didn't sign. It was important to me. I had to see the edges of my generosity so I could stop leaning on it. There were leverage attempts I hadn't anticipated. Tessa posted a stylized photo on social media of her smiling with a suitcase, tagged with a passive-aggressive caption about sudden life changes. Mutual friends called me to check in. and, more often than not, ended up relaying Tessa's version of things. It felt like being gaslit by a chorus. So I hardened my boundary into something logistical. I sent certified letters to the landlord and the bank saying I was withdrawing any informal guarantees. I changed the account that paid the family vet and explicitly reassigned responsibility to the person who actually owned the pet. I canceled the family streaming plan and split the cost into separate subscriptions. No more accidental cross-subsidies. I created an email folder called Family, Do Not Touch, and trained it to receive anything that looked like manipulation. It was petty in places and necessary in others. There was a weird satisfaction in the administrative neatness of it all. They continued to test me. There were surprise visits that felt like ambushes. Tessa at my door with a duffel bag and an expression that mixed hope and entitlement. Once, Martin showed up, keys jangling, offering to help me pack so it's not so hard, which is to say he wanted to be there when I backed away from putting other people's chaos on my shoulders. I listened, packed, and handed him a box labeled Shared Memories that was mostly old birthday cards and a dented mug. I said thank you and that I loved them, which was true and also separate from the financial line I'd drawn. The hardest part was emotional. Saying no is a pattern you have to practice, and each no came with a small, dull ache of guilt, as if a muscle you rarely use protested. But the guilt passed faster each time. The first week, my phone blew up with voicemail after voicemail. By the fourth week, it was quieter, and when they did call, the tension had a different texture. It wasn't as frenzied. Maybe they were recalibrating. Maybe they were learning that I wouldn't be their safety net anymore. Packing for Chicago felt oddly ceremonial. I put my essentials into 2 suitcases and a small plant. My stubborn little apartment Olive that had survived 4 moves and 2 neglectful roommates. At the airport, I felt what I had been denying for years, a sense of permission. Permission to choose my work, my city, my pace. The plane took off, and the coastline shrank into a thin, stubborn line. For the first time in a long time, the space beneath me felt like room to breathe, instead of a ledger I was obligated to balance. Moving didn't fix everything overnight. There were texts that landed like little hand grenades, guilt trips that tried to blow up my evenings, but each one bounced off the border I'd drawn. I'd reply with short, firm messages, or sometimes not reply at all. I unfriended the drama that fed on my attention. I went to work, met people who were excited by the same small things I was, a design challenge solved, a project launched, and with every tiny win, my old role felt more like a memory than a life sentence. On the last night before I left, Louise came over. She hadn't called it an apology. Mothers are weird about that. But she brought me a tin of shortbread and a look that said she'd been thinking differently. We sat on my couch, ate cookies that crumbled at the edges, and she said almost offhand, "You deserve to be selfish sometimes." It was the truest gift she could have given me then. A permission slip wrapped in flour. Then I left. I packed my keys into a little dish by the door, turned the lock, and walked out. I did not leave a trail of scorched earth. No dramatic notes, no vengeful declarations plastered on social media. My change was quieter, a legal unhooking and an emotional redirection. I didn't need to burn bridges to cross them. I just closed the gates behind me and started walking towards something that was finally mine. Chicago didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like vertigo. There's a kind of silence that hits when your phone stops lighting up with emergencies, when no one's demanding you fix something at midnight. For the first few weeks, that quiet was disorienting. I kept checking my phone out of habit, half expecting a crisis to appear like clockwork. But it didn't. Just work emails, a few new contacts, and the occasional meme from a coworker named Riley, who thought my deadpan humor was refreshingly blunt. My new job was everything the old life wasn't: structured, demanding in a way that built instead of drained. I got to make decisions that didn't ripple outward into family arguments or guilt spirals. I learned that I was good at what I did, not just responsible, but capable. My manager trusted me with projects that scared me a little, which turned out to be the healthiest kind of fear. By the second month, I could afford to furnish my apartment properly. By the third, I caught myself laughing out loud, unprompted, unfiltered, while walking home from work. It startled me how long it had been since I'd done that. It wasn't a revenge story in the traditional sense. No dramatic downfall, no screaming confrontation. My payback was absence, and it was devastatingly effective. When you take yourself out of the role that enables bad behavior, the system that depends on you starts to creak. I found out through a mutual friend that Tessa had tried to start her curio shop, but ran out of funding in a month. Without a cosigner or a sister's emergency savings, the reality of her choices finally met her. She moved back home. Martin and Louise had to face the math without me smoothing the edges, and apparently, they started budgeting for the first time in years. A few months later, the calls started again, but they sounded different. Softer. My mother's voice didn't carry that tremor of manipulation anymore, just the normal kind of missing someone ache. She told me about the new cat they'd adopted and how Martin had finally learned how to use online banking. Even Tessa reached out, not with an apology, but a kind of tentative truce. She asked how I liked Chicago and sent a photo of a small painting she'd done. Trying something new, she said. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and that was new. By then, I'd stopped needing their validation. I'd built a circle of friends who didn't see me as a resource, just as Gabriella. I learned to say no without explanation. I learned to spend money on myself without guilt. And somewhere between the skyline walks and late-night deep dish runs, I realized that peace isn't a feeling that arrives. It's something you build quietly, one boundary at a time. One evening, about a year later, I got a card in the mail from my parents. Inside was a photo of all three of them, Tessa included, at Thanksgiving. On the back, my mom had written, "You'll always have a seat at the table when you're ready." I smiled, set the card on my counter, and went back to my dinner. I didn't need to rush back, and they didn't need me to anymore. That, I think, was the real revenge. Not anger, not payback, but finally being free enough to just live.